find all of his great work over at RotoViz. It is fantasy championship week. There are so many people that are nervous right now, Sean. I'm getting the messages that are like from people that, haven't messaged me all year. It's not like they're messaging every week with start sits, but they're saying, look, I'm in the championship and I'm freaking out. Answer all these start sits. I got one for every position. And you get it, you understand it. We did this last week. We talked about the idea last week. We wanted to go through the different games and kind of talk through our read on the games, and that we feel that there are a lot of different things that can play into the start sit decisions. And a lot of that comes at the team level and in the game situation level, and then goes down to the player level and the distribution of volume and efficiency. And so I talked about this in the intro last week when we did this show, that when we make our start sits, Sean, we talk a lot about them. We go pretty in depth. It's hard, I think, from a practicality standpoint, to give the number of listeners we have and subscribers and those things the amount of time that would be required to answer all of the different start sits as delicately for the different formats and all of those things as probably should be. And so the thing that I always give as feedback is, if you feel strongly about something, or if you're leaning a certain way, I want you to play it that way. You probably have a better read than I do, but we're going to take a little bit more of a generic look at the different matchups this week. A typical preview type thing. Last week when we did this, I had a lot of notes about the spreads and the totals and the sort of the betting angles, and felt pretty good about that stuff as I was going to write that up. And those picks did really well over at my Stealing Lines betting venture. And some of the stuff we didn't take, but I mentioned, I got some feedback about, also did well. Like, I didn't have as an official bet that Miami over San Francisco, for example, but somebody mentioned that on social media, somebody mentioned after the fact that I, good call or something, that I had said that San Francisco being a 1-point road favorites felt a little bit odd, on the road in Miami, and that's how that game played out. So anyway, we had a lot of fun with it last week, Sean. We were fortunate enough to be pretty on point with a lot of the stuff, which was great, and we're going to go ahead and do it again. This week doesn't feel as clean and as comfortable, and I'm not promising that we're going to have the same type of success necessarily. It's a little bit of a different slate, a little bit trickier, but yeah, we're going to go through the different games, the things that we think are interesting, and give it our best old college try to predict the unpredictable, right?
We are. And I guess one of the positives that we have going forward here is that only 2 more games, well, except for the normal Monday Night Football, are going to be played not on Sunday. Ben, it's been a rough start to Week 17. The teams being asked to play early. Well, the Ravens were fine. The Chiefs were fine. Many of their teams have not been fine. Yesterday, we got what you get when you have 2 teams with horrible offensive lines face off on a short week in the rain. And as we were preparing for that game and trying to decide on things like, is Caleb Williams viable if you have other similar quarterbacks? Obviously, if you've got a good quarterback, you're going to go that direction. We were talking about the potential of the rain being a little bit of a problem. Obviously, rain does knock down things when you look at averages. The worst games tend to stick in your mind and scare you off all of these games, but you have plenty of games that are also fine. Last night's game was not fine. And I mentioned that in part because when you look at the weather for this week, you see rain across the board, which hopefully will not exactly come to fruition. And hopefully with a few more days to prepare, some of these teams will just be ready to play better football overall. But as we play for fantasy championships, you and I were sort of wishing that we could just have domes everywhere.
Yeah, as we were talking about it after the game, we were sharing some texts. Yeah, I was laughing that, when you're a kid, you get to play in the elements. I think I've talked on the show before. If it snows, go out and you play football, tackle football in the yard in the snow was awesome. We always made a point to do that. it's fun to play in the elements. When you're, an analyst or betting on the games or, playing fantasy football and all these things, it's not the end of the world, but it would just be preferred that they're playing in different conditions. I was joking with you. It's like, some of the conditions do get pretty extreme. We've always played through it in football. It's football weather, this, that, and the other thing. And you understand it and you get it. But if somebody had made some different decisions a lot of years ago about what really was football weather, instead of like playing the ice bowl in, negative whatever degree wind chill, we might have a totally different perception of all of that at this point in time. Because I was joking with you. I mean, you wouldn't see an NBA game played outdoors at this point. You don't see MLB games played through the elements. I know these are different sports and played differently, but when you think about the way that the advent of the forward pass and the development of it over time has become the major point of offense and what defenses are trying to take away, and is a really, really big part of football now, and not necessarily it wasn't necessarily that way in the 1970s, right? But it is now. And the precision that you need with the athletes that are out there to throw into these windows down the field, it's not massively dissimilar from trying to play an NBA game outdoors where there's some wind and they're trying to shoot a bunch of 3-pointers and missing a lot of those shots because they're playing in the elements a little bit, and instead of in a controlled environment in a gym. I'm not saying that every NFL game should be in a controlled environment, but I guess I kind of am, because I do think, in today's day and age with the way the sport's played, it really dramatically changes the things that you're able to do. We saw that, as you said, on Thursday night. These teams, they just played bad as well, but they had a really hard time connecting on a lot of the plays and on a lot of the throws downfield. And it wasn't even that bad in terms of the elements. It wasn't as bad as it can get in terms of the wind and a lot of those things. They should do a better job, sure. But when a team isn't necessarily elite, they're not necessarily going to be able to overcome the elements. They already have other issues and those types of things. And so it's just, you get really bad football. It was 6-3 at halftime, and you're like, that was one of the worst halves of football I've seen all year. And then nobody scored in the entire second half. Just absolutely crap. It was just bad, really bad football.
And the Seahawks grade out as one of the very worst run blocking teams, according to the Advanced Team Stat Explorer, which is powered by all the great charting from SIS. They're also one of the worst pass blocking teams. When Geno is trying to deal with that on an every play basis, when you're not really able to establish a run and bully the other team and even get some drives going, and then you have the rain, it just makes it tough. The Bears don't actually grade that poorly in either pass blocking or run blocking. And so a lot of what you're potentially dealing with there is offensive coordinator concerns, and just, I really like Caleb Williams. We saw a couple throws, unfortunately, the touchdown that was wiped away, where, again, you're talking about this crazy talent, and yet I'm kind of at the point where I feel like Caleb Williams may have the worst pocket presence of any quarterback I've ever watched play football. And now, granted, you every once in a while have like these third and fourth string guys who come in and are overmatched. And you're not grading him against those guys. Against all legitimate quarterbacks ever, he might be the worst. And so, anyway, not a great game. We're going to have some better games than that, Ben, as we look at Saturday and Sunday. We're going to get some points scored. I'm hoping we're going to get some points scored. If you have Nico Collins, if you have Zay Flowers, if you have
George Pickens, certainly. I doubt anyone's really playing Isaiah Pacheco, Keenan Allen, Jackson Smith and Jigba. It's been a rough start. If you had Xavier Worthy, you're like, I'm the king of the mountain, because he had a touchdown and hit 20 points. But I think he had 8 catches, and Travis Kelce had a nice game. Not sure that
too bad, because a lot of people are justifiably going to be like, Sean, you're now just like making up all of these additional Xavier Worthy touchdowns. But in addition to everything else that we've seen, the play right before Travis Kelce scores, if that defender who they kind of let go doesn't get his hand on the pass, there is no one on that side of the field to tackle Xavier Worthy who's going to walk in.
You and I are in it's kind of a 4-man free for all in the final of a dynasty league, and I have Mahomes and Worthy there. I was saying that to anyone who would listen to me at, at my Christmas celebration at my in-laws. I was like, they know that I'm into fantasy, and a few of the other family members are into it as well. And so they knew I needed Mahomes and Worthy, and I'm like, and they had already scored one TD, and if they connect for a second one, I'm off to the races. And what is a 3-week sprint in this final? It's an awesome league that Michael Leone has put together, where you and I are competing against each other, and our friend Pat Crane and our other friend David Smatic. So it's a fun little final four that are right up there. Our other buddy JJ Zacharysen's technically in it, but he was sort of trying to tank and accidentally made the final, and so his team isn't quite as good. But the four of us are all through weeks 15 and 16. It's cumulative points for the final 3 weeks, as well as your average score for the regular season, all get added together. Through weeks 15 and 16, our average score for the regular season, our scoring in weeks 15 and 16 all added up to where the four of us at the top were within 12 points. And so it's this really close match going into week 17, 4-way match. So you need to score to beat three other good teams. Anyway, that play you're describing, I'm going to get my second touchdown here because they blitzed off the edge. And then when they showed the replay, I'm like, look at this. They're going to block it all up. There's no one else on that side. They're going to block that up. He's going to walk in. But it got deflected. They blitzed off that side. If he just gets that throw out there. Anyway, that was, a potential another opportunity for Worthy. He continues to get good volume, even with Hollywood Brown in there. It actually has impacted, DeAndre Hopkins a little bit more. We do see a deep shot for Justin Watson, though. It's almost like they've stopped with the deep stuff to Worthy as much. And they've done a couple deep shots, though. The week prior, Mahomes missed Watson on a deep shot, but they've almost started to go the other route with some of the deep stuff. There was plenty of work for Worthy still underneath.
A medium depth one that Watson dropped last week, and then 2 or 3 weeks ago, he was wide open deep, and Mahomes did the same thing he's done to Worthy and just missed it badly. So all of those will be interesting. Worthy had the moderately deep end zone shot where he tapped his own heel instead of the second foot down in the end zone last week.
Right.
And so those are still going to be what I wrote up for the game coming into this week was that right now, especially when you consider that Worthy was drafted somewhat early, burned some of his biggest believers, which always has the effect of the people who are not in on you probably aren't going to draft you anyway, even as your price falls. The people who really believed in you and got burned can be more reluctant. Then he looks like he's setting up like these guys we got at such a big discount this year in terms of players who had already hit, and Jordan Addison, Jaden Reed, more marginally Jackson Smith and Jigba, those types of second-year players who have already scored at such a high level that, they should be expensive in year 2, but we're not for a variety of reasons. It'll be interesting to see where he goes, but coming off of this stretch to finish, it's going to be hard not to believe in that Chiefs offense again when Rashee Rice and Xavier Worthy are healthy and playing together with some experience. But we need to jump into the games that are still to come. Ben, who do you like? What game do you find most intriguing as we jump off?
Let's start with the Carolina-Tampa game. We talked about it a little bit before the show. The thing that I think is really fascinating from the market-based element is you have a 48.5 over-under, which is high. And there's certainly something we've seen in a couple of the last couple games, but we're getting a little bit of love for Carolina where, bad teams, even when they're playing good teams, that you don't have high over-unders. So what we do have here is Tampa as 7.5-point home favorites. I'm going to have to check some of these lines as we talk about them because we're recording this a little bit later in the week than when I was actually looking into these lines. But those look still right. Or the over-under maybe has dropped to 48, but still very high. Tampa, as a result of being 7.5-point favorites in a high over-under game, has the highest implied total. So when I say that, we talked about it last week a little bit. You can basically create an implied score from the over-under and the spread. If it's 40 points and a 6-point spread, it's 23-17, right? That adds up to 40. It's a 6-point gap. The favorite team is expected to score 23. The underdog's expected to score 17. In this case, with a high 48.5 over-under and Tampa is more than a touchdown favorite, they're expected to score up around like 28 points is the implied total, which is the highest on the week. And back in the summer, we're talking about week 17 matchups and those things. Don't think people were necessarily pegging Carolina Tampa as a shootout, and I don't think they were necessarily pegging Tampa as a team that was going to lead all the offenses in the NFL in implied, expected Vegas market implied points. But that is the case, and in part it's the case because Carolina's run defense is so bad. You talked about it in your 0RB watch list report. the title has changed over the years, and I could never get it right. I apologize. But 0RB Universe was definitely a name that has existed as well. Probably what it was this week. I'm a horrible co-host right now. But you talked about Bucky Irving absolutely smashing, looking great in the GLSP, looking great from usage perspective. I read the article, not the title, Sean. And this is a great matchup for him and for Carolina. And the coaching staff over there for Tampa was discussing this week a little bit of frustration with Rachaad White's fumble last week. He lost a fumble the week prior. He's lost 3 on the season now. But his fumble last week took away an opportunity to drive down and potentially win the game. I mean, they had an opportunity at the end of that Dallas game to still, they didn't play great, but to still go and win. He loses the fumble, game over. And both Todd Bowles and offensive coordinator Liam Cohen discussed ball security this week. Maybe bodes even more well for Bucky Irving this week in terms of the usage split. What do you think about this Carolina Tampa Bay game?
It should be fun, right? I mean, Bryce Young was dynamic a week ago, and if the Panthers can do their part, they have a train wreck of a defense, and so we should get that shootout that we're so excited about. You mentioned the situation there with White. I mean, he had a 2018 route lead. He did draw the targets. You could certainly see how, with the injury situation that Irving has had, that they're trying to use White in the only way that he is, moderately effective. But this could go all to Irving. If it did, and even if he loses some, because you frankly don't want him to try and handle every snap, but we're moving into a situation where he could be that Jahmyr Gibbs type of player this week. Now, he doesn't have, again, the long speed. I like to talk about that to emphasize that, those massive, massive games where you're breaking off 40 and 50-yard runs that end in the end zone as opposed to on the field are less likely from him. But Carolina's run defense has been among the worst in the NFL. They've been shredded each of the last 5 weeks. They're giving up almost 6 yards per carry in that span. This is a game where Irving could go for 200 yards from scrimmage, and then you hope that he finds the end zone a few times. The flip side of that is that the tools really like Young and the Panthers to be able to throw on this Buccaneers defense. It's been interesting because the flip side of that for people who are playing Chuba Hubbard is that the Bucs run defense has been absolutely locking people down. They're giving up very little EP, 30th in the last 5 weeks, very little fantasy points over expectation, again, 30th, which means they've given up the fewest points per game to the running back position. Again, over the last 5, that really challenges Chuba. Obviously, he has looked really good. The thing that happened last week is that he puts up one of his best EP numbers. When you're second on the week in expected points, and then you put up your own best points over expected for the season, that's when you end up with those 30-plus games like he got. I certainly wouldn't be betting against him, but it is a tougher matchup. The flip side of that, it's a great matchup for Adam Thielen. The mild concern there, Ben, and certainly jump in here if you have updated information. It sounds like Thielen maybe tweaked his hamstring in practice, and so you definitely are going to want to track that going into the game there. Jalen Coker also has a very good matchup rating, but you wouldn't expect the same amount of volume from him. Thielen is one of those kind of tricky choices if you do have a loaded team in the finals. The dynasty team that Pat and I have together that's playing in the kind of big money league there and is right there at the end potentially to defend our title we're going to have Thielen against a couple of other decent choices. And you always hope you pick the guy who ends up healthy throughout the game. Like just let him make it through. And I think that we're going to get the Panthers fighting back, scoring some points through the air. As I mean, you would expect the Bucs, especially after the disappointment last week, playing this defense with Mayfield playing so well, with Jalen McMillan starting to emerge, with Bucky having the great matchup. This seems like a game where they're going to score almost every possession. That would be a real breath of fresh air after what we witnessed on Thursday night.
Yeah, this would be a fun one. I didn't see the Thielen hamstring, but yeah, he wasn't on the injury report Wednesday, popped up Thursday, limited participant with a hamstring. Now, 5 different dudes for Carolina weren't on the Wednesday report and popped up Thursday. 2 of them were DNPs due to illness. 3 were limited due to, I mean, it kind of feels like maybe just vet resting a little bit, right? I mean, usually when you see a guy pop up on an injury report when they weren't on it earlier in the week, that's a pretty big red flag. But the fact that there were 5 different players that weren't on the Wednesday report but did pop up Thursday, to me feels a little bit more precautionary. Not a specific commentary on whether Thielen is going to play or not, but just something that I hadn't even seen this, and I haven't dug into any of the reports on Thielen at all. But if he's out, Jalen Coker, I think, becomes. I mean, Ligat has had a full practice and a limited practice the first 2 days of the week. We're recording this early Friday morning, so we haven't seen the Friday report yet. He probably returns, but he has not been a big-time volume earner in his rookie season, which kind of goes back to his profile. I mean, I feel like Coker would be a really interesting one. This does feel like a matchup where you're going to get the Panthers throwing, you're going to get the Bucs running. You might get the Bucs throwing as well a little bit, but they like to run when they can. The last time they played these guys, these teams played each other, Bucky Irving did go for 185 yards. You said maybe 150 scrimmage yards. I mean, that was his best game of the year. A massive game. But they haven't given him that big of a workload. He had 28 touches. He got, I think, a little bit banged up. He only had 5 touches the next week when he played through that, questionable tag, and then had the back issue flare up, and then wasn't able to really play much the next week. We'll see. I mean, I don't think they're probably going to give him 28 touches again, but like you said, doesn't necessarily have the long speed to break the really long TDs, but it's such a plus matchup, and he's so good at making the evasive moves when he has the one tackler to beat, and then getting into space and getting the 15 to 20 yard carries, and those add up quickly, right? So, I mean, if he can hit on a few of those nice chunk gains, he's gonna go for 100 plus very quickly.
And if they move White out of some of that receiving role, I mean, just last week, the Panthers gave up 10 receptions for 80 yards to the Arizona backs. Now, some of that is just, again, matchup specific, where at this point, that's almost the only type of pass that Kyler Murray can throw. But this is a defense that running backs can exploit in all facets.
Yeah. So that should be a fun matchup. With hopefully some real fantasy juice to it. Another one that we got to talk about that has a high over under. And I mean, the Carolina Tampa one in my notes, I don't really have a strong bet on. I don't have a strong bet on most of them, but to me, I was like, it maybe feels like an under, because we might get Carolina running even despite it being a bad rushing matchup because of Chuba Hubbard and because of Bryce Young and kind of trying to protect him. We might get Tampa running a ton, right, because of the matchup, and they'll probably run efficiently, but it keeps the clock moving. It's a high number to get to. I think there'll be points, but maybe there's not a massive amount of points. The other one that has a 48.5 over under is Green Bay, Minnesota. You have Green Bay. It's basically a pick 'em. Some books have it 1 point one way and some 1 point the other way. I'm seeing Green Bay as sort of more likely the 1 point underdog. They are on the road, so they're getting some love from the market, right, relative to the expected kind of home field advantage of 2.5 or 3 points to make it a pick 'em. And yet it still feels a little bit disrespectful, to Jordan Love to be +1 against Sam Darnold, even on the road. obviously Sam Darnold has played good football. Kevin O'Connell is a fantastic coach. I'm not trying to dog Minnesota at all. The over-under in this game, Sean, another 48.51. And, I mean, this one feels like an over to me. I mean, this feels like a game in a dome that is going to shoot out. I mean, these are two good coaches at designing shot plays. There's a lot of receiver talent in this game. We're going to get some chunk gains. We're going to get some touchdowns in this game, right? Right?
I hope. I have Blair Andrews' tool up that he uses to write the fantastic wrong read column on Saturdays. And one of the things that jumps out is that, both of these teams are good. I don't think that comes as a surprise to everybody, but the defenses can be tough. Each of these teams is among the best in creating pressure. So the amount of time to the pressure, the amount of time that they give you to throw, both of those are among the fastest, while both quarterbacks actually hold the ball. So it will be interesting to see how that dynamic takes place. Now, obviously, both teams are able to do that because their offensive lines and their play callers allow them to, right? Especially on the Packers side in the passing game, they create a ton of separation, top 5 there, and then create a ton of yards after the catch over expected, top 5 there as well. The problem is we know they just like to run it, which they are not necessarily as good at. The Vikings allow almost no yards before contact, and the Packers gain very few yards before contact because they don't try and disguise their intentions. Like, here's Josh Jacobs going to be coming right at you. So if the Vikings come at them with all of these stacked boxes, and that force us back into then a passing atmosphere, then since we have some Packers receivers, we don't have Josh Jacobs. And this game actually sets up better from that perspective than so many of them have. I think we will get the Packers forced to the air a little bit more. The question I would have for you is, can Sam Darnold get it done here? Are we going to see this 1-2 punch from Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison? We've got some teams where we play them together, a team that we're hoping to kind of jump to that kind of 75 range in the main event. A big game there would allow us to do that. This is the game we're very engaged with, those particular players. I think that we finally get the Packers to do something interesting this week.
I hope so. The last time these teams played, 31-29, the Vikings won that one in Green Bay. That was Love's return in week 4 after he had missed weeks 2 and 3. Threw for 389 and 4 touchdowns. Huge game. Also a very long time ago. And one of the long-term trends in betting overall is that the second matchup in divisional games tend to be lower scoring games. And so, teams know each other a little bit. They understand what they're going to see. So you do need to consider that when I'm sitting here talking about, taking it over and those types of things. You were talking about some of the other potential concerns there. It'll be an interesting one. And there's certainly the potential. I still think I like it to be pretty exciting, as you were saying as well. But there are some causes and some reasons for mild concern. Those games aren't even the highest over-under of the week. That is the Monday night game. Detroit goes back to the scene of their exit from the postseason last year in San Francisco. This is one that I'm sure they've had circled on the calendars for a while. A really heartbreaking loss in the postseason last year. You have a banged up defense, certainly. You have some questionable motivation on San Francisco's side, although I would say they didn't give up last week in Miami. The game kind of just went awry for them. I don't necessarily expect them to play like they don't have anything to play for, but I do feel like before they head to the postseason this year, Detroit is going to go into San Francisco and want to make a statement. I mean, this whole team runs on, adrenaline and Dan Campbell and all of those types of things. Dan Campbell as a personality, right? And the ways that they motivate and respond and act. I just feel like this is going to be a big game for Detroit. Their defense is banged up. I think the Niners can match that. I mean, you understand why the over-under is over 50 in this game. Detroit, 3.5 point road favorites. They do got to win this game. I mean, they're tied still with the Vikings. They're only a game up on the Eagles. They play the Vikings in week 18. So if the Vikings were to lose to the Packers and the Lions were able to beat the Niners, I think the Lions can clinch the division in that case. Or maybe I believe that would, I'm pretty confident that would, because they would then, even if the Vikings beat them in week 18, I think they would have the divisional record tiebreaker, which is the second tiebreaker. They would split the head-to-head. Anyway, definitely a game the Lions are motivated to win. Try to get home field in those things. It'll be a fun one Monday night. What do you think? You think the Lions are going to try to make a statement in the city where they were eliminated last year?
I think they will. And as you mentioned, they have a lot of incentive here. I think that Ben Johnson and the offense, and certainly Jared Goff, continues to have. I mean, the main thing is you have to win the game. But I think that you want to show that you can pass against anybody. You can pass in contexts that aren't as favorable. He was able to sort of dismiss the narrative last week about Jared Goff on the road in the cold, makes that amazing throw to Jameson Williams, which he manages to haul in. It's a tough matchup again this week. Even as they have collapsed, the 49ers have been good against the pass. Occasionally that can be because opponents haven't had to be as aggressive against them, but you go in and look at the last 5 weeks and they've essentially wiped out the opposing receivers. They're giving up the fewest receiving yards to the receiver position. They have the lowest racer allowed. They wiped out the Green Bay receivers. They wiped out the Buffalo receivers. Roma Dunze got loose against them, but then in the game against the Rams, Puka still is able to eke out a solid performance, but Cooper Kupp gets completely wiped out. Last week, they wipe out Tyreek Hill and the Dolphins. Now, again, some of that is because they're not forcing as much on the offensive side, but it is interesting when you pull up the passing matchup rater as well. It does not like the Lions this week, and it especially does not like Jameson Williams. That's tough. It's not one that I'm going to say I'm going to bench Jameson Williams in my leagues as a result. He has been so much more involved recently. And I mean, he's kind of moved from a guy who you need him to catch a deep ball to where if he catches the deep ball, then you have a big game on top of the floor that he's built with these more underneath looks. He and Worthy have so many similarities, and he's hitting on some of the big plays. Also, when they have the manufactured touches, and one of the things that's been a little bit frustrating in this 3-week stretch from Worthy where he's scoring 20 points a game is that he hasn't really broken some of these rushing types of plays. Williams has over the course of the last couple of years. So again, just because he has a 45 score in the matchup rater, which is 259th this week or 250th, Tim Patrick even worse there at 259. It doesn't mean that you're going to bench Williams, but it is something to keep in mind if you're deep. A lot of teams are going to maybe have a question between him and a player who most weeks has a similar projection. If that guy has a better matchup for you this week, maybe you go that way. Amon-Ra's matchup is better. So the passing matchup rater is telling us that the way that these guys line up, the way that the defense aligns, the strengths and weaknesses, what they play to is a little bit better for Amon-Ra. Now, having said that, his matchup is also not nearly as good as Jennings and Debo, who have two of the better matchups of the week. Ben, we know this Lions defense has been decimated by injuries. They came back a week ago and looked pretty good, but then you watch the Bears last night and you're thinking, okay, it's basically just that the Bears are that bad. We have a team where we haven't necessarily been playing either Brock Purdy or Debo Samuel, but especially after Debo is able to do some things last week, he becomes sort of an interesting desperation play for us. Debo probably not very heavily represented in a lot of these tournaments with how poor his season has been. It's kind of interesting to me that on the passing side for the 49ers, that they're generating almost no separation and the Lions are allowing almost no separation. Now, again, part of that is going to be less relevant because of the injuries the Lions have suffered. But this does seem to me like a game where the 49ers could come right back with what they did last week and actually successfully manufacture touches to Debo where he then runs after the catch.
Yeah, I like that. You mentioned the Jameson Williams rushing stuff, 42-yard touchdown run in this matchup last year in the playoffs that we were talking about. Had a carry last week, none the 2 weeks prior, but at least one in each of the 3 games prior to that. Has at least one carry in 8 of 13 contests this year. So they do try to give him the ball more often than not, on the ground. And he's been really good at those rushing opportunities. This year, averaging 7 yards per carry, obviously the long TD. Last year, you're talking about Debo a little bit there. Patrick Taylor played basically all of the running back work last week, even though he was very unproductive for anyone who was trying to stream him. I thought he just didn't look very good, frankly, as a 26-year-old journeyman. Kind of understood why they've been playing even the rookie Guerendo over him so clearly. Guerendo is questionable this week, may be back. I think he's a pretty interesting player. I know people talk about sort of running backs don't matter, this and that. I do think it's possible that Taylor, if Guerendo's out, could have a better game this week. I don't think he's, incapable of that. And I think the usage is really interesting. And so if, again, Guerendo's out again, I do think Taylor's worth going back to in this matchup. But if Guerendo's in, I think you will see quite a bit of Guerendo in the sense that I do feel like they trust him quite a bit as, for a rookie and are very confident in what he can do for them in all phases. He's been really efficient as a runner and then what he can do for them in the pass game as well. Looks, I think, a lot more comfortable when you watch him so far this year than Taylor looked last year, frankly, even though Taylor is a little bit more of a vet.
Well, and to add a little bit of nuance to that, I mean, SIS has, Taylor had 5 targets. They have 3 of those charted as catchable. They have 2 of the 3 catchable targets charted as drops. You can certainly understand why Debo would be drawing running back-ish work, and that if Guerendo is available, that he would be slotted right back into a pretty full opportunity.
And that was really the tie-in was if Guerendo's banged up or limited because Taylor was struggling so much, that you would think Debo would get that work as well. So I think that plays into the Debo element as well. It'll be a fun one for sure. The other high total game that we got to talk about before we, kind of try to rapid fire through some more of these games is the Denver-Cincinnati game. We got a lot of players in that game that we like. Obviously, Denver, throughout the year, it's been fun to track Bo Nix and some of those guys. Not a ton of dudes there that we're really relying on because of how unconcentrated that offense is. But over on Cincinnati's side, you got Jamar Chase, you got T. Higgins, you got Chase Brown, really the one that has been fantastic. Your other cover boy, along with Bucky and Jahmyr Gibbs for your zero RB universe. I had to look it up. So I didn't say it wrong. Universe article this week. Bengals are 3.5 point favorites. They are at home. It's maybe a slight boost to the expected sort of 2.5 to 3 point line for a home team. Typically, like a very small edge toward them from a team strength perspective, what the market is saying. But the over-under, very, very high, 49.5, 50. I don't have a strong lean in this game, Sean. I think Denver's obviously very good. They're expected to get Riley Moss back, who's been out for a while. He's their other good corner alongside Patrick Surtain. You have the Bengals being really aggressive and throwing, and Burrow playing at a really high level, and yet not necessarily getting the results that his level of play suggests. And Denver, in some ways, get results better than the way that they play sometimes, right? They're able to find ways to win games defensively, and I think through game management a little bit, even when Bo Nix maybe hasn't played as well. I'm thinking of the what was it? The Colts game recently. Was that last week? I can't remember. 2 weeks ago. Yeah, 2 weeks ago. But they were able to win 31-13, even with Nick's not necessarily playing a great football game. They played on Thursday night last week against the Chargers. They lost by 7. They get an extra. They've had a little bit of an extra preparation period, 10 days until this one, or actually, I guess 9 days, because it is a Saturday game, one of the 3 Saturday games we have this week. But yeah, I mean, this seems like another one that could really shoot out on Saturday and should be a lot of fun.
It should. And in part because you have a white-hot Joe Burrow against an elite defense, and then you have this interesting combination of Bo Nix and Sean Payton against a Bengals defense that generally looks like they're playing 10 guys. And so that could go a lot of different directions, right? We think about the Bengals passing offense, the pressure rate that they face, that shows up, pretty dramatically in Blair's tool. They don't have a lot of time to throw. They face a lot of pressure. The Broncos create a lot of pressure. The Broncos are one of the hardest teams to create EPA per pass against. They don't allow a lot of passing yards per play. All of those types of elements make it tougher on Burrow. And yet at the same time, Ben, you and I have been talking about this for several weeks now as we look to set our different lineups against the Broncos, where the Broncos' rushing defense is so utterly dominant that they face a lot of passes. And that's despite the fact that they play almost exclusively light boxes against the run, but they're one of the best teams before contact, one of the best teams after contact. As a result, they're top 3 in rushing yards over expected allowed. They are the top team in EPA per rush. That funnels everything back to the passing game. Then over the last 6, which I believe is what Blair's tool focuses on, the Bengals have attempted the most passes per game. The Broncos defense has faced the most passes per game. Even if the defense is very, very good, right? Then you're starting to look at this situation that is maybe similar to what we got when Jameis Winston and Jerry Jeudy came out playing against the Broncos here, as opposed to just a pure revenge game. The Bengals are playing for their playoff lives, right? I mean, these two teams are really the 2 main contenders for that last playoff spot. They're not the only contenders. But when you put that type of matchup together, you're thinking, well, this could be the 4th time this season that Jamar Chase goes over 40. And that's despite the fact, obviously, that the actual matchup for him is not going to look as strong, but it's more neutral than you might think in the PMR. The matchup here for Vele, very, very good. Sutton, pretty neutral. Then the GLSP has Nix with one of the top floors of the week. And we think about that from the perspective of he's probably going to get some rushing yardage. This Bengals pass defense is excruciatingly bad. You have a variety of manufactured types of things. One of the interesting dynamics, I think, will be, do they trust him in this game, which so much is on the line? After 2 weeks ago, as you mentioned, he attacks deep very unsuccessfully. Then last week, they actually go pretty shallow. And in the first half, it looked like that was going to be perfect because they were scoring at will against the Chargers, going underneath. They build a big lead. In the second half, the Chargers control the ball, come back, win the game. I thought that part was fascinating just half to half a week ago. And now when we come out with the season on the line, what is Sean Payton's game plan going to be?
I mean, that's a great question. But as you mentioned, Cincinnati's defense is beatable in a lot of different ways. So whatever the game plan is, you would expect there to be something effective in there. Yeah, I anticipate
Javonte Williams for 15 yards.
Yeah, I don't know that Javonte Williams is the way to play it. I do expect Nix to play well. I think that's a really interesting note that he has such a high floor in the GLSP, but I also think it makes a lot of sense in this game. You've talked about the Denver pass defense getting a lot of volume against them, and we know that as you were just talking through, Burrow's gonna throw, right? And so this game could have that real back and forth element to it, as you were just talking about. This seems really, really fun. The Javonte Williams note, I mean, obviously you were kidding, but I did, as I was going through my input volatility piece over at Stealing Signals, have a hard time even sort of figuring out how to talk about this backfield, because you had Blake Watson in there looking pretty good last week. You had Audric Estime as kind of the guy that looked like the lead. He was getting the early carries, but he would run on 1st and 10. They'd take him right out. They were like intentionally rotating a bunch. You also have Jaleel McLaughlin expected back this week, and Tyler Beatty practicing, or Tyler Bidet practicing in full. He's questionable. I almost think they aren't going to activate him, which is kind of a little bit of a bummer, but he is coming off a pretty serious injury. But he's practiced in full and apparently is ready to go. And I've seen the reports and the beat writers are basically saying the only big note for the Broncos this week from a health perspective is whether they do activate Bidet. If they activate him, and maybe even with just McLaughlin coming back, Blake Watson's probably back to being deactivated. But I mean, the Broncos backfield is suddenly very crowded with McLaughlin back this week. I don't even know how you can play Javonte very many snaps. You should be playing Estime, Jaleel, but we've been saying that for several weeks, so who knows what'll happen.
Well, this is the, just archetypal movable force versus movable object versus resistible force, where the Broncos rushing metrics in basically every category are at or near the bottom of the NFL. The Bengals rushing defense at or near the bottom of the NFL in every defensive metric there when it comes to stopping there. Yeah, it's really, I think I tend to make some pretty aggressive statements on how good or bad teams are, Ben, but it's really difficult to overstate just how bad the Bengals defense is in every possible way. Their yards after the catch over expected and their passing defense, for example, are just so astronomical. And it makes you flash back to that Steelers game where the Steelers were able to throw the ball to basically anybody, right? Including people who run like 5.5 40s and they would run for 30 or 40 yards. I mean, this game should have a huge number of points scored, especially again, when you have Burrow and then when you have a play caller like Sean Payton facing a defense this bad. I mean, it just seems like the last team to have the ball will win.
You're going to get, Nate Adkins running in space in this game because Sean Payton's going to make sure to get him. And he's going to get a 20-yard gain, to your point. Yeah, no, this seems like a really, really fun one. Yeah, hopefully lives up to the billing. The other Saturday morning game, I mean, we're recording this Friday. A lot of people are not going to be listening to it until after some of these Saturday games play. But I wanted to talk to you about the Saturday morning game. The Chargers, 4-point road favorites at the Patriots, who played much better. I mean, they didn't necessarily play better, but they finished much better than the line. we talked about this one earlier this week where they didn't score. They didn't look great offensively necessarily, but they still were able to keep that game close and lose a close game that, frankly, if they don't throw the backward pass and give up a defensive touchdown to the Bills, they maybe should have won. But yeah, we have the Chargers coming to New England this week, 4.5-point favorites. It sounds like J.K. Dobbins is going to be back, which I think is a pretty big boost for the Chargers. It also sounds like Gus Edwards, or he has been declared out, will be out. And so Dobbins is back. You get him, alongside Vidal, but likely leading that backfield again. And their offense just really got one-dimensional after he got hurt. I feel like him coming back is another one of these running back transactional things where, I mean, it's a bigger deal than maybe people are going to think. We're kind of trained to not think like the running back movement and health and stuff really matters because it's a replaceable position, right? But I mean, Dobbins, so much more versatile and dependable than what else they've been able to play at that position since he's been out. There's a low over-under in this, Sean, 42.5. I feel like I'm leaning toward the over in this one because I do want to be a little bit in on Drake May as well. You obviously have Justin Herbert. When you have Dobbins back, as I'm talking through, the Chargers need to win this. It feels to me like because of the two quarterbacks in this game, who I do think are both good quarterbacks, even though it's an outdoor game, there's going to be some plays made in this game. Am I hopeful? Is this wishful thinking?
No, I think that there will be. One of the things that is pretty impressive about the Chargers, and it's something that they did emphasize when they were playing the Broncos last week. Basically, they've beaten all of the bad teams. They've lost to all the good teams, with the lone exception being the Broncos, which is controversial from the perspective of the Broncos have also beaten the bad teams, lost to the good teams. And then obviously now the Chargers have both of those head-to-head victories. That's despite the fact that the Chargers are a pretty weird team when you think about what they want to be, right? Their passing defense is very mediocre. They give up a ton of yards after the catch over expected. Their rushing defense is absolutely terrible. They give up the third most yards per play, the third highest EPA per rush. They're one of the worst teams both before and after contact. And then on their own offensive side of the ball, they're not a good rushing team, right? They don't do anything particularly well other than create some explosive plays, and they face a huge number of stacked boxes because opponents know, again, what the Chargers would like to do, which is to control the game. So you basically come back to the Chargers more or less winning with smoke and mirrors because their passing offense is also poor. And yet what they do is essentially not make all of the big mistakes that you see from most of the other bad teams. So when they run up against a similarly untalented team, of which there are many, they come out ahead. That makes it a little bit weird when you're trying to work through the matchups, because you're thinking, okay, this Chargers team is good, and yet they're bad at every specific thing. And so every specific area should be bad for them, should be exploitable for the opponent. It is a game here where you would think that Drake May could go off, because you wouldn't expect the Patriots, well below average defense, to stop Justin Herbert. And then you get this sort of stealth shootout. I could see this one pretty easily going over. Maybe it's just hope. Again, mostly what the Chargers are going to do is sit back and let what looks like a pretty clearly overmatched New England Patriots coaching staff. You talked about the backward pass. I can't get over how if you don't make that play, then you are not necessarily going to have the upset, but you're in position to upset the Bills. Maybe one of the big flies in the ointment here is that it's going to be cold-ish, probably in that mid 30s, and it's going to rain. And so when you talk about, as I've sort of discussed it, two teams that aren't really good at anything, don't have a lot of weapons in the passing game. The Chargers, unclear about the running back. I think that J.K. Dobbins adds an absolute ton to that team. So if he could come back and actually be healthy, that would be a big deal. The Patriots are so unhappy with their running backs that they're talking about benching Ramondre Stevenson again. Despite being really good on a per play basis, he simply cannot hold on to the ball. And in the contemporary NFL, especially when your offense is bad, that makes you unplayable. No playmakers in this game. Rain. Let me rephrase that. This game, Ben, is guaranteed to go under.
I like the game to go over. Let me rephrase that. Guaranteed to go under. No, I think, again, the rain doesn't look horrible from what I can see. Are you seeing like really bad rain? It's not going to be super bad, right?
Just that it's going to rain and it's going to be chilly, which.
Okay. Yeah, we'll see how that one goes. We're going to bump through a few more of these. Arizona.
I was optimistic about Seahawks and Bears in moderate rain at moderate temperature. Yeah. And they might have, been playing in zero visibility with 10 feet of snow.
Well, these quarterbacks, I think, are going to be a little bit better. And look, it's a day game, so it won't feel as cold because there'll be sun in the sky. Arizona and the Rams. That's proven to be scientifically proven. I made that up. Arizona and the Rams. Rams are 6.5-point favorites at home. Big game for them. Big game for the Seahawks as well. If the Rams win it, they are in all likelihood going to win the NFC West, presuming they get, everyone's been talking about they could clinch the NFC West if they get 3.5 wins, so 4 wins out of the 6 teams. But really, it's 4 wins over the next 2 weeks. So they talk about they could clinch it this week, but really the Rams need 4 wins out of this list of 6 teams over the next 2 weeks out of 12 possible outcomes. That list includes good teams like the Vikings and the Bills, and I believe the Bengals are on that list. And so, they're very likely to get it, which means if they win this game, they're very likely to go on to win the NFC West. The Seahawks really need the Rams to lose. And then when they play each other in week 18, the Seahawks could win a different tiebreaker by beating them. They would win divisional record tiebreaker because the Rams losing to the Cardinals would then break an eventual tie for the divisional record if the Seahawks then beat the Rams. All very complicated, not the most important thing in the world. The point is the motivation is on the Rams side in this game. The Cardinals eliminated. Shawn, you followed the Cardinals fairly close. Have not been optimistic with the way Kyler Murray has played lately. Is there any reason to believe that the Cardinals can come out and play an inspired game and compete in this one? It's kind of a high over-under as well at 47.5. And I was looking at that with this big spread, if the Rams win, if they cover this spread, it's probably because the Cardinals come out flat. And then usually with the blowouts, you do kind of tend to go under. You're talking about, one team not scoring enough points for both for the total to get super, super high. Just look at some of the games we've seen in the last week. You look at the Ravens Texans, it was 31-2. So you get 33 total points. Obviously, you wouldn't expect the Cardinals to score 2 points in this game, but if it is something like, 30-10 or 27-13 or whatever, that's 40 total points. This one, 47.5, kind of a high number. Do the Rams run away with this? And does it stay under? That's kind of the way I'm looking at it.
The Cardinals are such a weird team that I think you can't just look at them being bad, which is where they are right now, and assume that they'll be consistently bad throughout the course of the game or that strange things couldn't happen. One of the things with Kyler Murray that makes him so frustrating as you're trying to think through, should you play him this week? Should you acquire him in Dynasty? As you go through the years in redraft, should you select him? Can you select the guys who are playing with him? The performances are just all over the place. He has been running successfully recently. And again, it depends on where you're invested. Because a week ago, if you needed Trey McBride to make your push in various leagues and you see him consistently getting open and Kyler looking for another read that's more vertical, not finding it, pulling the ball down, scrambling, Trey McBride 5 yards away from him, begging for the ball, and Kyler Murray kind of telling him to turn around and block somebody because I'm going to run it myself, which in some cases does make sense, right? If you're the guy running forward and you're fast and all those types of things. But then you see Murray, as you talked about, just exhausted throughout so much of the game because of all the running that he's doing. They also have multiple complicating factors going into this game specifically where they put their tackles on injured reserve. And so you would think that he would be under immense pressure in this game, that he'll have very little time to throw. That could potentially be positive for these dump offs to McBride, but we know that he needs the play to develop usually because he can't see the player initially get open, right? He's got to let the play develop so he can kind of get himself around the offensive and defensive lines. They've also talked about, and he's talked about, Marvin Harrison not getting the volume, not being used effectively in the offense, that the way that they're using him right now won't work for what they want to accomplish as a team. So you get the impression that one of the things that could happen in this game where they probably won't be able to block is that they're also going to try and throw some passes to Marvin Harrison. I'm concerned that you could have a catastrophic collapse type of outcome from the Cardinals, but you could also have a game here where they're surprisingly competitive. They have had moments. Their defense is not good either. and it's sort of bad across the board. But as you talked about, they do some interesting things to disguise what they're doing, even if they're mostly doing things poorly. So opponents will make some mistakes, and they've gone through stretches where they play really, really hard. I think that their coaches are in a bit of trouble. I think that their offensive coordinator should be fired. He's probably under some pressure. You have a game here where, I mean, James Conner could be anything from not being able to play to being the guy who gets everything done. GLSP actually likes him as the second highest scoring running back of the week. I don't think that that's the case at all. I think you have to push him way down. I mean, the GLSP doesn't know that he's injured, right? Even if he weren't, I would push him down. With the injury, you push him well down, but it gives you a little bit of a window into what this matchup would be if you don't have him injured, if you don't have the offensive lineman injured, all of those types of things. The Cardinals have so many talented players that, if they hit on some of the right things, if they make some of the right play calls, an upset here, I don't think would be that unlikely. But again, the specific context isn't great for it. I would note that the matchup rater does not like their receivers for this game. So even before all of those difficulties, it wasn't a great matchup. Another little note, the PMR likes Cooper Kupp quite a bit better than Puka Nacua. And that's simply just how good the matchup is, not how they're going to score. We know that Puka has been hot and Cooper Kupp has been ice cold. I mean, maybe this is an opportunity to get him going a little bit.
That would be nice. Some of the teams where we have Kupp aren't really in a position for that to matter. Way back in week 2, Marvin Harrison had his first big game of not many, but he had the 2 long touchdowns in this one, in this matchup with the Rams. 4 catches, 130 yards, 2 TDs. The Cardinals dominated that game, 41-10. That was a long time ago. Rams fell to 0-2. They didn't have either. No, they did have Kupp in that game. They didn't have Puka in that game. And yeah, they weren't able to do a whole lot on the road. Very different scenario now. I think you've talked me into basically this being a no bet, because I do think this is it really just kind of comes down to whether the Cardinals show up or not. And it kind of feels like a coin flip. It's not going to be, it might seem obvious in hindsight, whichever way it goes, but I don't think it's going to be very easy to read in advance. They may come out flat and you're like, yeah, well, they were always going to come out flat. That was kind of the way I was leaning. As I said, they may come out and be feisty and you're like, yeah, I mean, the Cardinals are always feisty. You always see Kyler Murray, competing and playing hard. And you mentioned a lot of reasons with the coaching staff and those things that they should be trying to play hard. Our dynasty league, Shawn, that we talked about a little bit, I got both James Conner and Trey McBride. I need them to come out feisty to be able to take you down in that championship.
Well, I mean, at least this one, I talked about there being a lot of rain, and we may not know up until close to game time how much rain each individual game has. It's great to have some players in a dome.
Yeah, this one is in a nice weather-controlled environment in Southern California. One that is not in a weather-controlled environment is the Jets traveling up to Buffalo, although I don't think the weather's expected to be too bad. But you do have sort of a similar effect as last week that I talked about when the Bills hosted the Patriots, where there was a big spread and the over-under felt like it was splitting the difference between the Bills expected to score some points and the Patriots weren't expected to necessarily score a bunch of points. The over-under this game, 46.5, similar, but the Bills are 9-point favorites at home. This is not the way that the Jets season expected to go, where they would be 9-point underdogs in week 17, but they're yet, almost as big of underdogs, not quite almost as big, but certainly heavy. Actually, it's moved to 10 as I look at it. So they're getting close to as big of underdogs as the Patriots were last week. That over under has actually come down a little to 46 as well, looks like, or 46.5, looks like. Yeah, it's a half point depending on the book there. Anyway, looks like the market is expecting the Bills to score some points. The Jets defense is not very good. I feel like the Bills are going to bounce back and have a 30-point game. They didn't last week for the first time in several weeks. The Jets play so slow, though. I mean, they can slow down any game. I have this game in my notes as like a stay away from a betting perspective. I don't feel good about it at all. it's the 10 points now is a big number. I do feel like the Bills can pretty easily cover that number, but also with the way that the Jets play slow and are good enough that they could score late. I mean, you could have a backdoor cover in this game, right? It could be 14 points late and they get a late touchdown to lose by 7. It could be 27-20 and then you lose it feels like an under to me, I guess, a little bit, but I do think the Bills are going to score. It's a tricky one. You have any strong matchup related elements that you feel good about in this game?
Well, the GLSP is not that high on James Cook, which is in some ways not surprising because his production has been so heavily dependent on massive fantasy points over expected numbers. Now, the flip side of that is that the Jets' run defense has been very stingy in allowing fantasy points over expected. They've been one of the very hardest to get that on in the last 5 games. They also don't allow a ton of receiving yards to the backs recently. The Bills, in part because of this unstoppable, unusual, unicorn-like force that is Josh Allen, the Bills are one of the very top teams in creating yards before contact in the running game. You're going to get that when you have an explosive back like James Cook, who then has holes, right? So if you can get through the line, if you have that explosiveness, you're going to have it. The Jets are the number 1 team in yards before contact allowed. Maybe that's a bad matchup for James Cook. Maybe it just means that once you get through the initial line, there's no one left to tackle you. So that part will be somewhat interesting. I also think that this is a game where the Jets could score quite a bit. This Bills defense doesn't look quite as bad as they looked against the Rams and the Lions when you go play Drake May and the Patriots. But partly that just emphasizes how poor the Patriots offense is. If you have a game where Aaron Rodgers is mildly successful and they can drain the clock, and this feels like a trap game for the Bills to me, I guess, is kind of the way I'm looking at it. They have to be disappointed that the Chiefs went ahead and secured home field. I mean, Josh Allen now, I think, has a lot of work to do, but I think this is the appropriate moment to re-interject my concerns about Josh Allen as the MVP. I think if we're going to go based on record, we have to have either Patrick Mahomes or Jared Goff. If we're going to go by best player, I mean, Lamar Jackson and what he did again on Christmas. I mean, Lamar Jackson has been the best player. It seems like Josh Allen is getting boxed out. I mean, you can't just be like the hybrid version of those two things, right? Like the best player who also has, like, his team managed to lose fewer games than the Ravens. You're not seeing this as a trap game where there are a variety of kind of lesser factors that favor the Jets. I mean, one of the things that I do see popping up, not a great matchup for Garrett Wilson, according to the alignment data. One of the things, again, in terms of not exactly a squeaky wheel, but he more or less came out and as opposed to being like, you got to involve me more, he's just like, please. I mean, I would like to play. Will you throw me some passes?
Yeah, I mean, the MVP one is, I don't know if we talked about it on the show extensively last week. You and I talked about it before the show and have differing opinions there. I'm pretty into the Josh Allen argument. But you were making a strong case that if you go by statistics, I mean, Lamar Jackson's statistics are meaningfully better. And then I was making a case for some of the like EPA type statistics where you can see our buddy Kevin Cole's done some research on this. Maybe we talked about it on the show a little, but Josh Allen has done a really good job with sack avoidance, and some of his turnovers haven't necessarily been the most costly, and he's limited turnovers. But like last week, or the week prior, he had a third down, arm punt that he threw up, and yeah, it's a pick, but it really wasn't that much different than if they would have punted on the very next snap.
Well, especially when the opposing team takes it out to the 1 yard line.
Yeah, that ended up being sort of helpful. But he's been better than Lamar on an EPA per play basis, at least coming into this week. Lamar had another strong game and is obviously playing an incredible season as well. Probably with Lamar for me, it's like he's already won twice. I mean, he's a superstar. I mean, he's
You got to give it to the best
superhuman.
player, because Patrick Mahomes is going to get to the end of his career, and all of the MVPs that he lost to players like Aaron Rodgers, because people are like, let's spread the wealth a little bit.
Yeah. It's not a great way to do it, but I mean, Josh Allen is right there. And if he's right there, I don't think you can even make a strong case that he's behind. I mean, literally right there. And they have a better record than the Ravens. But you really think that Jared Goff should win it, which was the real guy that we were talking about last week. And I was joking with you. I mean, if he's the most valuable player, why did he throw for like 89 yards in one of the games that Jameson Williams missed, and then like 130 in the other one? Like, they couldn't even throw downfield when they lost one receiver on the field. Anyway,
got to blame David Montgomery. He evidently the most important player in the Lions offense. We are, bummed for him that he got hurt, because you don't want him to miss what's a fantastic and really exciting end of the season for the Lions. It does free them up to play the best version of their offense.
Atlanta, Washington, another one where we're expecting rain. I was just looking, the Buffalo one, I don't think is expected too much rain, but that is one to keep a little bit of an eye on. A little bit of wind, maybe like 10.
Yeah, the wind looks like it could be the issue there. Hopefully that will change.
Yeah. Atlanta, Washington, from what I understand, might have a decent amount of rain. You're getting a matchup of two rookie quarterbacks who finished 1 and 2 in the Heisman voting last year. Michael Penix made his first start last week, did some good things, throwing into the intermediate depths and areas of the field. Didn't actually have to drop back a whole lot, because Drew Lock was doing his very best to make that game uncompetitive prior to any opportunity for Atlanta to need to throw the ball or any of those types of things. They're giving up, defensive touchdowns left and right. It seemed like this one has a pretty high over under 47.5. With the rain, the rookie quarterbacks, I mean, I kind of feel like maybe Penix doesn't look amazing in this game. I thought he looked really good last week, but with the rain, with the rookie quarterbacks, with all these things, and it's not expected to be like, I don't think massive rain, but there should be at least some from what I'm seeing. I'm a little bit skeptical of that high over under. Washington 4-point home favorites. This was a game I was really excited about back in the offseason. I mean, I thought this was one I loved to stack. I thought getting pieces of Atlanta's offense and getting Jaden Daniels on the other side was going to be super, super fun. I guess coming into this week right now with where we're at, I feel like it's going to be a little bit underwhelming, a little bit too run heavy on both sides. What are you seeing in the matchup? Any optimism for passing?
Probably not. It looks, very neutral for the receivers. It's a great matchup for Brian Robinson. He obviously has been pretty disappointing during this playoff stretch. The Falcons are sort of a weird team in that they have played such an easy schedule. They're a little bit difficult to even evaluate. One of the things I noted was that the actual numbers that they're giving up don't look that bad, but we have, schedule-based adjustments in the streamer. And so when you've given up 19 points to Javonte Williams, 19.5 to Amir Abdullah, 17 to Tyrone Tracy. Tracy's obviously had some good games, but when you're giving up a lot of points to that Giants team, that doesn't look particularly good when you think about what the expected numbers would be for players like that. Yeah, Jaden Daniels, though, anything that we can get here from him, I think that is the fun part with this particular game. And when we think about the Falcons side of it, Bijan Robinson, Washington has been pretty tough against the run, except for when they play Saquon Barkley and the Eagles. So again, it depends a little bit on what the expectation is, but they have given up 34 points and 27 points to him. Both of those coming in the last 5 weeks. Certainly, if you have Bijan, you're thinking, well, he's going to be the guy who goes out and gets it done at that level this week. He has the 4th best projection according to the GLSP. And certainly if someone felt like she should be the number 1 ranked running back, maybe by a ways this week, I wouldn't push back against that at all. So I think you're seeing the running backs as the interesting sort of fantasy pieces, and then that narrative with the young quarterbacks. What can Jaden Daniels do to follow up what I think last week was his best game of what's been a pretty extraordinary rookie year? You think about that combination of the running and the passing. And our show on Monday was basically about how he was even better in that game than what the stats indicated. The Falcons do not have a good defense. This could be his time to shine and make the case that, not that he's going to be the fantasy MVP this year, but you had mentioned at times you thought that he was in the MVP mix before really that chest injury had kind of knocked his stats down for a while. I think that this game is going to be the one that, if the weather cooperates at all, he can kind of establish himself up there with the Lamar Jacksons, with the Josh Allens as the next guy. And what you're hoping for, as we think, through it more big picture, every week with CJ Stroud, you're thinking, well, this is the bottom. And then every following week, there's no bottom, right? It's probably the most stunning thing I've seen in the last 20 years of the NFL. I don't think that we're going to get something like that in the future with Jaden Daniels, but certainly we hope that he can avoid the sophomore slump. That's not what we're looking at this week. We're looking at the fantasy championships and the fact that you have Daniels against a passing defense that allows, top 5 in passing yards per play, top 10 in EPA per pass. They give it up a ton of time to throw. They give up a lot of yards after the catch. That would help, some of these guys like a Ray McLeod. I'm pretty excited for this game. If Michael Penix, if your guy here, and I say your guy, obviously huge Husky fan, you've mentioned some of the weaknesses he brings. I hope that he is awesome in this game and we get a shootout. This is kind of the game where, again, you wish it were in a dome, because then you'd be talking about how this game might be the most fun game of the week.
Yeah, definitely one of those ones on the schedule where you're like, this should be played at the other city and it would be a lot more fun. Penix, if you're looking for optimism, I just made a comment. I'm a little concerned that he doesn't necessarily play great. He's got big hands. He throws a really tight spiral on basically everything. So in terms of being able to play in the rain, you could be mildly optimistic about his actual throwing style. The issue is just, again, that his really strong trait is really accurate throws into the intermediate range, 10 to 15 yards downfield. You start talking about the elements, those are more difficult to complete down the field, right? It's not these short passes with yak and those things I'd be less concerned about. It's being able to rip throws. And he did this last week. And the things we were excited about were these, timing patterns on, again, 12 yards slanting across the middle of the field. He's hitting a guy in stride for some catch and run. That's harder to do for anyone, even if he does throw a really good spiral in the rain. And so when you're relying on that type of passing and downfield passing of any kind, it just seems tricky. And honestly, if you were reliant solely on deep passing, like Jaden Daniels can throw the deep ball really well, you're like, well, maybe he can still hit 1 or 2 deep shots. But when you're relying on a bunch of 15 to 20 yard catches to rack up 250 to 300 passing yards, you're like, okay, well, you're probably going to miss a few of those, right? It's trickier to see him have a huge passing game as a pocket passer. But I do think if any young QB or any, not any QB, but of various QBs, he could be one that could do it because, again, of the hand size, the grip strength, the spiral that he throws. There are some reasons to believe that he won't be dramatically impacted.
And Ben, just a week ago against Eagles team that had Kenny Pickett in there, they do give up 897 and 1 to AJ Brown. The Falcons don't have an AJ Brown, and Drake London has been limited this week, but is expected to be fine for the game. And maybe London can be his guy in the intermediate range, help him move the chains, and then you end up with an efficient offensive performance.
Yeah, they definitely need to be able to throw the ball some, at least, to let Bijan get going. You're talking about Bijan. You mentioned the Stroud thing, and we've talked about that basically every week, how shocking it is. When I was watching him this week and the pocket presence stuff, I mean, this is just a little bit of a tangent by way of trying to come up with some explanations. Going into last year, part of the reason I was skeptical of CJ Stroud was that he got such good protection at Ohio State. There was a lot of talk about how good of protection he got. And then it was, okay, the game's a little bit faster. The game speeds up on you, and he may not get as good of protection. And so what is that going to mean at the NFL level? He passed all those tests with flying colors last year. But this week, for the first time really this year, I was like remembering back to that very specific take that I had last offseason. And I was like, I mean, as far as the sophomore slump goes, it does feel like that a little bit, where the game is fast for him and he's not getting the protection that he was afforded in college and used to, but also didn't really get last year. And again, didn't necessarily struggle. So it is weird, the timing of it all, but it does very much seem like he's not comfortable in the pocket right now. And he does still have a long history of having the time to stand back there. And the game has now had to speed up this year, especially to a degree that he can't necessarily keep up with right now. And anyway, I'm hopeful that if they can protect him better in the future, he can get back to playing better football, because this has been a tough year for him. Agree with you. It's one of the most baffling things. We've been trying to find answers. Shawn, there's 5 games we haven't talked about, but they all, I left all the ones that have these low over-unders. I'm going to just fire off all 5 and then ask you sort of what you think are reasonable. But as far as like the spreads and the totals and those things, you have Tennessee at Jacksonville. Jags are a -1 at home, 39.5. All these games are down at the 40 or lower mark. You have Mason Rudolph in there. I do think this game could be a little bit more exciting than the 39.5. You have, or maybe if you have a thought or two on these before, I guess we go through all 5 of them. Do you have any quick thoughts on Tennessee Jacksonville?
I hope that Tony Pollard is healthy, but I hope that Tyjae Spears gets extended run. He's just been absolutely phenomenal. And you can obviously, I don't say do whatever you want. You can do a lot against the Jacksonville defense. This would be a fun week for Spears to end up his season on this multi-touchdown hot streak. He's the guy I'm keeping an eye on in that game.
That's a fun one. Vegas, New Orleans. We're going to get Spencer Rattler again. Or I guess the quote was, as long as Derek Carr's not ready, but I don't think he's expected to be. Over under 38.5, even lower. It is a dome game. You get Vegas as 1-point road favorites, which was, I think, Vegas has done nothing to earn being a road favorite at this point in the season. It tells you what you need to know about the Saints, who got shut out last week. This is a gross game, but I'm hoping that Brock Bowers has plenty of room to roam against the Saints.
Bowers has had a lot of really, really good numbers in the passing matchup rater. That'll be something to kind of keep in mind a little bit, perhaps, when you think about next year. And it's going to be hard to keep expectations or hopes in check. He has had good matchups. That's, mostly neutralized to eliminated by how bad his quarterback play is. But we keep talking about the 40-point game. He's got the best matchup of any player in this game. It's coming, right? I mean, it has to happen now. And this is the last fantasy chance.
It's not going to happen. Yeah. I will mention also, I mean, a lot of people were looking at the usage splits for the Saints last week. Jordan Mims played a ton in the second half when that game was well out of hand. It felt like they were getting him more run. Kendre Miller got the start. He got the early work. He got the first reps on the second drive. He got the first reps after halftime. He got all of those like starter moments, and then they pulled him because that game was a blowout. If this game is close, they're 1-point favorites. I think you have the potential for Kendre Miller to actually be the lead back for 4 quarters in a game instead of Jordan Mims basically played the entire fourth quarter. I don't think another back, because Jamal Williams wasn't coming in either. I don't think they were like trying to feature Jordan Mims is what I'm getting at. That game was very out of hand. We'll see if Kendre Miller has the potential to do something interesting against Vegas. He's another one to keep an eye on in that game. Indy at the Giants. Colts are big favorites, 7.5 points on the road, even with Anthony Richardson not necessarily healthy. 40.5 over under. If it's like, it feels like a blowout line to me where they're saying, the Giants may not even be competitive here. Drew Lock expected to start again. Is there any reason? I mean, can we play Malik Neighbors and Tyrone Tracy? I mean, I think they're playable, right?
The Tracy stuff has been infuriating. I thought he looked healthier last week, but then he's missed practice. As for recording, I'm not sure he's going to play in the game. That would be a disappointing way to end what has been a fantastic season for him. He's not been David Johnson, but when you talk about a big back with plus athleticism, plus lateral agility, receiving ability, his touchdown catch last week, it wasn't difficult, but it also was one where you're like, oh, that looks like more like a receiver than a running back.
All those,
those little notes are things where the upside there. Tyrone Tracy though has been this sort of fluky, high value touch machine. I say that as a huge fan, someone who's playing him a lot, but as you're thinking about whether or not you can play him, if indeed he's available for this game, there's been luck involved in him being able to get the scores. Now, again, the high value touches are hugely important. That does give him the upside, but when your team is as bad as the Giants, there's been some fluky positive elements to him actually being able to score points in these games. I do have Malik Neighbors benched in my leagues where I have another viable option. I certainly wouldn't tell anybody to play Wan'Dale Robinson, but if you're desperate or you're playing weekly types of contests, the matchup rater loves him. And somebody has to be kind of a make volume, manufacture play. We know that Wan'Dale, at least he's been used with the Giants. One of the things I noted in the offseason is that his collegiate numbers actually led you to believe that there could be some more there. There hasn't been with New York, but if you're looking for someone who might catch or might get 13, 14 very low value targets, if you're in a format where that actually helps you, keep an eye on him this week for that. But otherwise, as you mentioned, in this game, not super interesting.
But you would play Neighbors if you didn't have other good options. You're just benching him in spots where you have good options. Yeah, he's gotten a lot of volume. Sean's nodding for those of you on the audio. Jonathan Taylor will be fun to watch as well. He was so good last week. Dallas at Philly. The Eagles are 7-point favorites at home, despite Nick Sirianni, as we're recording this, Sean, saying it's going to be tough for Jalen Hurts to play. The expectation is he's probably not going to play in this game. Kenny Pickett versus Cooper Rush, except Cooper Rush, who's played pretty well and been, a feel-good story, will not have CeeDee Lamb because CeeDee Lamb has been shut down for the rest of the year. And we know that Dallas's offense is basically CeeDee Lamb. Like, they don't have anyone else. So you got Cooper Rush coming into Philly with basically no other key options. You can talk about Brandon Cooks, Jalen Tolbert, Jake Ferguson. Rico Dowdle has done an admirable job for, who he is, what he is. The over-under in this game is 38. It feels low because the Cowboys are really willing to throw the ball. The Eagles are still going to be able to run. Like, Saquon Barkley is probably going to run a lot in this game with Kenny Pickett. And yet, are the Cowboys going to do anything offensively? Is Kenny Pickett going to do anything? Or are they just going to really coast to a victory? I don't know that this number is very, very low, but it's also I don't know that I feel confident taking the over in this game. It could be a boring game. It could be a 20-17 or 23-14 or something that comes in under this number.
Yeah, one of the things that jumps out to me, Rico Dowdle, who has been very good over the second half of the season. I don't have a lot of Rico Dowdle. I'm not necessarily rooting for him. Obviously, I have zero Ezekiel Elliott. I'm not invested in this per se. I still thought that Elliott getting the goal line carry last week was maybe the most undeserved touch I've ever seen in a football game.
He got one carry for 1 yard and a TD. It was absurd. I loved your comment in the Zero RB universe that his blackmail material came through again because why did he get it on the field? That was absurd. You're right. So undeserved.
Dowdle fights him all the way down. And Dowdle didn't have a good game in that game, but you look at the last month, 6 weeks, he's fighting to get them into these situations where they can, and again, it's not the running back who is allowing the Cowboys to, have this stretch of 4 wins in 5 games, but you have a team overall that's competing. You watch Rico compete. He's someone that I mentioned, you would have expected if he had the intangibles that a starting running back needs, you would have expected him to have gotten his opportunity earlier and done something with it, but he is somebody who's athletic. Well, I think the intangibles have been great. He fights like crazy out there. He gains extra yards. He is athletic. He's been a big piece of it. I mean, why you would have a player battling like that and then you would not reward them with the high value touch? I just, purely from a right and wrong perspective, that one really bothers me. He has a very low projection this week, in part because they wouldn't be expected to score many points, and the Eagles' run defense is very, very good. They're third best in EPA per rush. They're very difficult to gain yards after contact against. So it's frustrating for Dowdle managers because he has had a good season. Maybe he does break through. And in a game like this where the Eagles will, they're not the same team, but Kenny Pickett is out there. The whole mentality is very different. Maybe he breaks through and thwarts the expectation. But I mean, this really looks like another Saquon Barkley game with not a lot interesting going on otherwise.
Right. Miami heads to Cleveland. Another one where we're going to get some rain. Over under 39.5. Miami 6.5 point road favorites. It's a blowout line. Another big spread, low total. Browns are preparing for Dorian Thompson-Robinson to start again, and that, I think, explains this whole spread. In one of our leagues, Sean, we have Drake May, Anthony Richardson, and Tua. You mentioned to me the decision kind of between May and Richardson there, and I was thinking we hadn't discussed Tua. I was thinking if you were not really super into Tua as a result. It's kind of interesting with the rain and everything. Miami's done so much of their run game as short passing, which has made Tua more interesting. They do all the run game extension stuff, wide receiver quick hits to Devon Achane, quick stuff to Jonnu Smith, get the yak on those plays. Instead of trying to run behind a bad run blocking offensive line, they've tried to use the perimeter and wide receiver blockers on DBs as their run game. Throw it out there and block out on the edge. That's mildly more difficult when you talk about some elements and you talk about some rain and those things. They may still be able to do that, but they may prefer to be able to try to just turn around and hand it off and run the ball straight ahead. Can they do that? Can they do that in this matchup with Cleveland? I feel like 6.5 point road favorites is kind of a big number for these guys, even though I have zero faith in Dorian Thompson-Robinson. So it's probably a game that I'm staying away from. It's another one of these matchups I mentioned at the top of the show. Some of the matchups this week are just not that fun from a betting angle. I don't love this one because I definitely am not going to back Dorian Thompson-Robinson, who we've talked about as basically not being a viable starter. And then he went out and played a pretty poor game last week.
He played a pretty poor game.
So, yeah, it's an understatement. All right.
Did we get any information about whether the NFL was considering our proposal to fine teams who start players like Drew Lock and Dorian Thompson-Robinson?
I think they're going to get back to us on that. They said they're really reviewing it internally, but no word yet.
So the Browns defense is weird. A lot of their peripherals aren't that good. We know they've given some teams some trouble. Teams are not throwing a lot against the Browns, and you wouldn't expect the Dolphins to need to throw very much in this game. Some of the context that you mentioned sort of leads into a projection from GLSP for Tua that is pretty catastrophic. He's basically the lowest projected real QB playing this week, which again, that's not where I would put him. I think that's overly harsh, but the numbers that we're getting for some of these guys with extremely wide range of outcomes like Anthony Richardson and Drake May. I mean, May's actually had a very tight range of actual scores. I think when you look at the specific game, there's some room for optimism there. May has one of the more interesting ceilings, according to Gillespie, even though I don't think that we have necessarily seen that on the field. And I'm skeptical of that. That's the reason why those are the names that I popped up when we're looking for a big score this week, to try and jump up the standings a bit. It doesn't seem like Tua is the path, especially with Waddle out. Not even that Waddle has performed this year, but just as their overall passing game gets less and less talented, that's sort of what I'm looking at when I'm thinking that Tua doesn't make for a great play. Obviously, DTR takes out basically Cleveland's entire roster. Now, I've noted there are some positive things for Jerome Ford as it relates to him being in there. I guess when you look at specifically the Miami matchup, where Miami's run defense is fantastic, those probably eliminate Ford too. My thought is that fantasy managers should be playing as few players from this game as they realistically can.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Waddle, limited practice Thursday. I think there's some chance he might return. Okay. Or is he officially out? Have you seen that?
He's officially out of my lineups.
Yeah. That's the right way to approach it. I wasn't going to make a strong case for Miami just because Waddle was in. DTR, I wrote about him this week as Jameis Winston with all the bad stuff, but with none of the good stuff, because he took 5 sacks, he threw 2 interceptions. I talked last week about how he hadn't had more than 165 passing yards in a game, but this was almost certainly going to be the game where he did that. They're playing the Bengals, and he's going to play the whole game. He's going to set a new career high for passing yards. It's 165. He threw 34 times. He did not set a new career high. 157 passing yards. Again, took 5 sacks, 2 interceptions. He did run for 49 yards. He's mobile, but you have to be able to play the quarterback position in addition to the mobility. He's not a very good quarterback, is the bottom line. They are preparing to play him again. It's a tank job out there in Cleveland. That'll do it for the games, though. That was our last one, Sean. You convinced me as we talked through that game that I'm probably going to play the under, even though it's 39.5. I just don't see, because they're not going to score 1,000,000 points in that game, but they're not going to need to score a ton. I just don't see that game really getting nuts in any kind of, first team to 20 is going to win, I don't think either team's going to get to 20. Probably. This is a 17-13 game if I've ever seen one. So you were talking about the GLSP not loving Tua. That's not understanding the weather element, which this is supposed to be a bit of a rain. I guess I haven't checked that weather.
Rain and wind. Yeah,
rain and wind.
I was watching last night's game with some folks, and when it was 3-0 and both teams looked bad, I got a projection of 6-3. And I said, no. It looks like that, but Caleb Williams has done some second half stuff. Geno can make some throws. We might get some defensive points. It may look bad now, but these games tend to have some scoring, even if it's random. But the score was 6-3. That might be more than we get from, the Dolphins win this game easily, but this isn't a game you're chasing for fantasy.
It literally, look, I'm not saying go bet your house on the under, but I think we agree it very well could be like a 13-3 type game. There's also a lot of scenarios where weird things happen, and it's always important to discuss that stuff. But yeah, this one doesn't feel like a big scoring game. So we'll see. Maybe Jameis Winston comes in. That's where you'll get the points. If they get Jameis Winston, last week he was the inactive third quarterback. If they get him as the backup, then you start to get a little worried about that under, because if Dorian Thompson-Robinson is bad enough in the first half, they put in Jameis Winston, you get a half of Jameis Winston. The Dolphins will be scoring defensive touchdowns. The Browns will be scoring offensive touchdowns. Everything is going to score if Jameis Winston's out there. So, that'll be. I was going to say that'll be a fun one. That won't be a fun one unless Jameis Winston does play. Then maybe we'll pick up a little bit. Yeah, this is fun, Sean. I'm excited. Good luck to all of the listeners. Championship week and weekend. Lot to come. 3 games Saturday. I believe it's 9 games on Sunday. You get the Monday nighter. Hopefully we get some good football. It's been tricky through, for Monday night. The Christmas games weren't necessarily amazing. The Thursday night game this week has been rough, but hopefully we get some good football. I'm excited. We talked about the Saturday games as being potential over bets. That Broncos Bengals game is it's got a really high number, but it's gonna be a high scoring one. There's gonna be some fun stuff on Saturday and this weekend. Hopefully all of our listeners get the things they need. And good luck.
Yeah, good luck. Happy holidays. Week 17 has felt anticlimactic so far, but it's important to keep in mind only a few games have played. So many of the weeks recently have been very high scoring. We could still have a high scoring week. You hopefully have most of your players still to go. You're not saddled with too many really low scores. Even if you are, as long as you have player minutes remaining, you've got a chance. You can get some big scores down the stretch. Good luck to all the listeners. We love you guys. This exercise, Ben, has been so much fun for me. We hope, again, that we're more right than wrong, and then we help some people out. It's been a special episode of Stealing Bananas. I'm Shawn Siegele. With me, as always, is Ben Gretch. You can follow at Yards Per Gretch, at Ben Gretch on Blue Sky, Stealing Signals. Today, we've talked a lot about stealing lines. If you don't subscribe there, you're missing out. Join Ben, win some money. Subscribe to Stealing Signals YouTube as well. We'd love to have you guys over at RotoViz. I think we'll just have a few more days of the holiday special. If you are meeting with family late in the week, I know growing up that the Christmas time period was so much fun because you get to see some family members here, some there, get to celebrate and open presents all throughout, many times all the way through the new year. It's a great time. If you don't, Christmas is over, Ben, but there still might be some situations where you need a last minute present. Don't hesitate to use us in emergency situations. Those will be ending, but obviously the Stealing Signals and RotoViz subs for 2025 are where you're going to get so much of what we talked about today throughout the course of the next year. Again, leave us a rating review. Those help us a ton. We love you guys. We'll talk to you soon.